Kia ora, and welcome everyone to this interview with Professor Sara Kindon from the School of Geography at Victoria University of Wellington. I'm your host for this interview, Angela McCarthy. I'm Professor of Scottish and Irish History at the University of Otago, where I am also the Director of the Centre for Global Migrations. Professor Kindon is a specialist in refugee resettlement in New Zealand and is due to speak at Dunedin Race Relations Week Forum on Thursday, the 25th of March. And it's a real pleasure to have some time to speak with Sara ahead of this annual event. Sara, could we begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Angela, and thanks to Lux for inviting me into this space. It's really nice to be with you today. So I'm originally from England. Grew up there near Birmingham in the centre. I studied in Canada and in Indonesia and spent time in Costa Rica before coming to New Zealand in 1994. And I've been working at Victoria University ever since then, so almost half my life. I'm also married to a wonderful Australian man, Jeff, and we have two beautiful boys who are 11 and 17.
Great, thank you, Sara. And before we turn to what you might talk about at the forum, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how you became interested in working with former refugee communities, a little bit of that history.
Yes, sure. So back in 2005, I was setting up a new postgraduate course about participatory research, which is an orientation to working with communities that treats them as experts in their own lives and seeks to affect positive change through research. And one of my friends suggested that I might have a conversation with Changemakers Refugee Forum that was just being established in Wellington to see if there were any synergies between what I was hoping my students could learn and contribute and what the needs might be. So I met with Adam Awad and Sue Driver, and we formed a partnership where postgraduate students at Victoria in geography and development studies, anthropology, would then work alongside former refugees, mainly young people, to do research that they wanted on issues that they wanted. And out of that, I got introduced to this amazing world of former refugees living in Wellington and then beyond across the country. And we've done an amazing amount of work together since then. So that's how I got involved. And what's that now? 13, 14 years later, I can't think of doing anything else.
Wonderful. I wonder if we could move on, Sara, just to, obviously you're going to be here in Dunedin for the Race Relations Week Forum. Without giving away everything that you plan to talk about, could you give the listeners an idea of the types of issues that you will address in that discussion with the other participants?
Yes, it's a great honor for me to be coming down and joining other, people on this panel, some very distinguished speakers, and I think it promises to be a really valuable and important discussion at this point in New Zealand's history. My particular orientation grows out of comments that were made following the March 15 attacks and the Commission of Inquiry made by the Prime Minister and Minister Radhakrishnan about the importance that all people living in this country should feel safe and feel that they belong. And for me, the key word in that sentence was feel. Because if we're not working with how people are feeling, we don't have any way of developing effective practices or systems or processes to enable them to belong and we don't have any way of measuring how well we're doing as a country in welcoming new people, in supporting and uplifting people who've been here for a long time but come from diverse backgrounds. So I want to be thinking more into how we work with emotions. This is a very emotional space. As soon as we start talking about race, we're talking about immigration, we're talking about national identity, we're talking about the connections and the place of Marae as Indigenous people alongside newcomers. It's full of emotions, but we don't often acknowledge that. We don't often talk about people's feelings and how they enable people to either have a wonderful experience and really grow and thrive and flourish in a new country, or how they may not be able to do or achieve or be the kind of person that they want to be when they're here. So that's a little bit. And also as a geographer, of course, I care very deeply about people's relationships to place and the incredible, valuable resource and the incredible emotional connection that people often have to land and place. So there'll be a little bit of that in there too. And hopefully I can be presenting things that will stimulate thought, because really the idea, I think, of the panel is to stimulate discussion. So hopefully people will come with their thinking hats on, their hearts open, willing to engage.
Absolutely. I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion emanating from the issues you've just described now, as well as what other contributors will offer as well. I wonder, could you actually tell us, just to probe you a little bit more, to tell us a bit more about the types of refugee groups and communities and individuals that you've worked with, given that they're not a homogenous group, they're all very different, how you've worked with them, and perhaps telling us a little bit, what are some of the key outcomes of the research that you have pursued?
Sure. So over the years, the majority of the research that I've been involved in has been with refugee background young people. So people primarily between the ages of about 15 and 30. And we've worked with people who've come originally from different African nations, from within the Assyrian community, young people from Myanmar, from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Colombia. So a really wide range of young people. And the way that we carry out research is involving people as partners. So a lot of the research is driven by issues that the young people wanted to explore themselves, involving them to develop their research capacity, and then telling stories and working with key stakeholders. So one of the earliest projects that we did involved some young people and the Evolve Youth Centre in Wellington. Many people, particularly from different African nations, raising issues of discrimination, particularly treatment by the police at the time. This was in 2005. And that led on to some very productive conversations with the police. And in fact, one of the youth leaders from that now, Phil Pithieu, works in the New Zealand Police Force, supporting their efforts to increase diversity. So a really sort of tangible connection from early research through to his professional career and transformations happening within the police as a really important institution. We also worked with Te Papa, the Museum of New Zealand, to enable the museum to recognize that if it was going to work with refugee background communities, it was important to honor the knowledge that people had and build capacity. So with the museum, that led to a nationwide engagement of young people in their communities to create sculpture, to create videos, dance, poetry, short stories. And that when fed into this beautiful mixing room gallery, which has been in existence now for over a decade because it attracts so many people and because it is so engaging. The last example perhaps I'll give you, Angela, and the listeners and viewers, is working across the country again with organizations providing higher education, so polytechnics, universities, private training organizations, to understand what the experiences of our refugee background learners have been. And with partnership with Changemakers Refugee Forum and Pathways to Employment, channeling that into a paper that was tabled to the Minister of Education to argue for greater attention and resourcing for our refugee background learners, recognizing their diversity, recognizing some of the broken educational histories that young people have gone through, and also recognizing the incredible demands on young former refugees' time and energy, supporting their parents, being involved in their faith communities, translation, caring for siblings, earning money. So that is still a live conversation. And that also informed the establishment of a national tertiary network in late 2019, where now a number of tertiary organizations are getting together to look at how we can work together to support refugee background learners at that level.
That's great, Sara. And obviously you're hoping to host an event here in Dunedin in early 2022 that brings some of those tertiary students together, building on the fantastic event that you held in Wellington. I think, was it a couple of years ago now, that particular event?
Yeah, December 2019. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're very much looking forward to that. I wonder if we could move on to reflect and ask you about how successful or not New Zealand is doing with its refugee resettlement program. Are there parts of the strategy where New Zealand can do better? And are there parts that we are very innovative and where other countries could actually learn from us?
Great question. And I think it's a question that increasingly more and more people are asking, which is a good sign, because I think it means that there's an openness to reflect on what we're doing and continually look to improve things. So I wanted to answer this question by firstly acknowledging the huge numbers of people that give considerable time and energy to work alongside former refugees. And some of those people are former refugees themselves, so that they bring their experience and their insider knowledge of resettlement to support others in incredibly generous ways. But we have an amazing number of people in leadership and as volunteers who work tirelessly to do what they can. I think that the refugee resettlement program has been hugely successful in welcoming people to New Zealand. What happens at the Marae Resettlement Centre, I hear time and time again of how important those first few weeks are for people feeling welcome, safe, hopeful, and to see that there are so many other people like them. You know, friendships are built. So Mangere and what goes on there, I think, is something that many international observers have seen that they could learn from. I think also the commitment to wraparound support, the provision of basic needs, housing, connection to doctors, connection to schools, the supporting into language acquisition for future employment, all of those things absolutely vital. The provision of mental health support services for those former refugees that may need that support, and not all do, clearly. But that is also well done, and we have some wonderful people in all of those areas. I think where we could be doing better, and the conversations have already begun, is firstly to acknowledge that we have treaty partners. We have tangata whenua, we have Marae, who have not really been involved sufficiently, some might say at all, to actually conceive of how we practice refugee resettlement. And I think that is a huge area of opportunity, particularly given that Māori, from my experience of having worked with colleagues and friends in Te Iwi o Ngāti Hauiti in the central Rangatike, among others, Māori have a history and understanding of displacement. They have a really deep understanding of the significance of papatuanuku and whenua, and also of manaakitanga, among many other important concepts and ways of being. They also have rights here as Indigenous peoples, of course. And so I think that's one area where we could do better, is to more fully engage them as partners. I also know from many resettling refugees that they're very curious and open to learning from Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, and that there are many similarities in terms of coming from collectivist cultures, of deep understandings of spirituality connected to land and other living beings, to understandings of holistic health. So there's many synergies there that I think could be enhanced that would benefit resettlement outcomes.
Thanks, Sara. And not just in terms of Māori not having that consultation with refugee resettlement, but immigration policies more generally that we hear about. We have 5 new refugee resettlement areas that have been established in New Zealand. So at Levin, Masterton, Blenheim, Timaru, and there's one other I've forgotten. What do you think those communities, that their biggest challenges will be with the former refugees that will come in once the COVID restrictions have been relaxed? So challenges maybe for the community and challenges also for the former refugees, and perhaps also maybe to reflect on some of the benefits as well.
Sure. Yeah, and I want to acknowledge here the work of Murdoch Stevens and all of the people who got behind the Double the Quota campaign, and the receptiveness of the government to enabling these new resettlement centres. It's really fantastic that we can, as a country, open up more spaces for people who need refuge, particularly given the growing numbers of people displaced around the world. So the challenges, I think, are primarily around managing expectations and understandings. So for many people, not just in these resettlement areas, there's a lot of stereotyping and misinformation about forced migrants, about refugees and asylum seekers. So I think being able to help people understand why it is that we have refugees in the first place, what has produced the conditions that have created the need for people to flee and seek safety. That's really important, but also raising awareness and understanding about what it means to arrive in a country where you didn't choose to be here. You're very grateful to be here, but you didn't choose to be here, and you have to establish a whole new life while there's still a life going on where you came from, be it a camp or from your country of origin. So I think it's helping people to have realistic expectations and understandings of who is coming into their community and what needs might need to be met. but also helping to manage the expectations of resettling refugees about the kinds of towns, communities, environments that they're going to be in. Because people have obviously come from radically different geographic locations. Many people may have come from very dense, large cities or very large, sprawling camps. And they're coming into somewhere like Masterton or Levin, beautiful, but a radically different scale. Not so much nightlife, very different smells, different opportunities for work, different foods, different ways of socializing, different ways of worshipping, all of these things. So I think it's helping former refugees to have a better understanding so that they're not dealing with as much shock when they get to these smaller resettlement centres, and helping the people there have a better understanding of how they might be able to support people to settle really well.
Absolutely. And the input from individuals like yourself with your experience, Murdoch Stevens, for instance, I think all of that is going to be really helpful in terms of what's gone before and learning from that as well. That influence on those communities will be great. I wonder, Sara, you're a professor of geography, you have research students. I wondered whether you might just tell us a little bit about some of your students' work, the groundbreaking research that they're doing in this area of refugee resettlement.
Yes, I'm very blessed by the students that I work with. So the most recent student who's completed, almost, sorry, waffling here because I've just got an abundance of beautiful graduates I could talk about. So an important piece of work that my master's student, Sarah Willett, completed was building on the research and the activism we've done in the tertiary education space, better understanding the experiences of former refugees. And that has really been the kind of fuel for this national level advocacy and the development of a very strong partnership with the Tertiary Education Commission and Sarah Williams there. And it's leading now into the development of some best practice guidelines, which we'll be consulting on through the sector. And Sarah is leading that work now, best practice guidelines for supporting refugee background students. I've also had the pleasure of working with Amber Kale, and Amber's thesis is soon to be examined. Amber worked very deeply with some women and girls from Myanmar in Nelson to understand their relationships to place and how their attachments to place helped fuel their well-being, what helped them to stay well on the resettlement journey. And she did that through a beautiful process of creative exploration with women out in situ, gathering seeds or branches, talking about the meaning of trees, of flowers, of places, of smells, of weather, of sunlight, all growing things in the garden. She involved them in painting aspects of their evolving understanding and identity. And this led into some beautiful recommendations for how particularly resettlement practitioners, but also health and wellbeing practitioners, could really work more in a more holistic way with people resettling through their relationships to place, their connections to the ocean, their connections to land, and so forth. And then I've also had the pleasure of working with Marika Jasperse with a collaboration through the University of Otago Medical School. And Marika worked very closely with a number of practitioners supporting refugees to look at some of the ways that representation of resettling refugees isn't always acknowledging of their strengths, their resilience, and how sometimes the portrayal of trauma is exaggerated because there's a need to bring in resources to fund fund the services that are being provided. And so that important work, teasing out some of the politics of representation in the mental health sphere, has also been really enlightening to me, and also hugely important work.
Yeah, it's fantastic work that they're doing, and obviously very lucky to have you supervising their research as well. I am conscious, Sara, that we're getting near the end of our time period, and I wonder if I might close with a question that relates to the work that goes on in the universities. We are very, very in a strained environment, and I wonder how you balance your research, your teaching, your activism, and your own personal life.
Yes. In a nutshell, I choose to focus on joy. So I'm a big believer that whatever we focus on grows. And I've also had the benefit of some wonderful training from an organization in the United Kingdom called One of Many, which focuses on women's leadership and empowerment. And I'm training to be a women's life coach with them at the moment, which is giving me even more joy. But there is so much joy. There's so much to be thankful for in terms of the work that I get to do, the people I interact with, contributing in some small way to positive change in people's lives, learning from people. You know, that gives me, that focus on that joy really gives me the energy to keep going. But also I'm very fortunate to have a very loving, supportive family and partner, some great colleagues like you, who are also committed to this kaupapa and this work. And I gain a huge amount from every interaction I have with former refugees, learning from their stories, their insights, their faith, their cultural nuances, their languages. There's always more to learn, and there's always more to contribute. So that's, if I focus on joy, most things take care of themselves.
Absolutely. I think that's a really wonderful note to end on, the focus on joy. It's a positive note to wrap up with. And Sara, I just want to thank you so much for spending some time this afternoon to talk about your research, and also to give the listeners and viewers a little bit of insight ahead of your discussion on Thursday, which will be taking place at the Marae at Shetland Street at Maori Hill, and you'll be joining a number of panelists there. So that's Thursday, the 25th of March, 6:30 p.m. So we trust it will be an absolutely fantastic event, and wish you well for that. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you, Angela. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, it was really stimulating for me to think through some of the responses to these questions. So thank you for taking the time to make this happen.
Thank you.